Welcome to welcome to the 5 themes of geography. Today's topic, today's exciting episode is on hemispheres. So what is a hemisphere? Well, Sad Earth tells you that a hemisphere is half of Earth. So we use the equator and the prime meridian to divide Earth into half. That is why Mr. Earth is very sad. So the equator divides Earth. All right, so we have Earth. Here's our equator. It cuts Earth in half. Remember, the equator is 0 degrees latitude. It is like the belt of Earth. It divides Earth into a top half and a bottom half. Using our cardinal directions, we know that the top half is known as the northern hemisphere, or the northern half. And this bottom half is known as the southern hemisphere, or the southern half. Okay, so we use the equator for the northern hemisphere above the equator and the southern hemisphere below the equator. The prime meridian divides Earth into the eastern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. So here's Earth divided by the prime meridian. Remember, the prime meridian is 0 degrees longitude. It goes from the North Pole to the South Pole. It goes up and down. And so on the western side of the prime meridian, it is the western hemisphere, the western half. And the eastern side of the prime meridian is known as the eastern hemisphere, or the eastern half of Earth. So every location on Earth is either in the northern or southern hemisphere, and the western and the eastern hemisphere. So they're at least part of 2 hemispheres. There are continents that are part of every hemisphere, and we talked about that last week. So here is a map of Earth, and if I want to know the location and the hemisphere that a city, a state, a country, a continent is located in, the first thing you have to do is find the equator. So I see the equator, and it cuts Earth in half, right? The equator. Once you find the equator, you know the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Now we have to find the prime meridian. Again, the prime meridian is 0 degrees longitude. I see it. We're going to color that one blue. So we found the prime meridian. And once you find the prime meridian, you will be able to determine the western hemisphere and the eastern hemisphere. So let's practice. Let's start with the United States. I have it circled in green. The United States. I want you to tell me out loud, is the United States part of the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? I can't hear you. Correct. It is part of the northern hemisphere. We find the equator. Is it above or below the equator? Well, the United States is above, which means it's part of the northern hemisphere. Is the United States a part of the eastern hemisphere or the western hemisphere? Say it out loud. A little bit louder. Yeah, correct. It is part of the Western Hemisphere. We find the Prime Meridian and we see which side the United States is on, the eastern side or the western side. Let's practice again. We're going to focus on the country of Madagascar. All right, so Madagascar is a country in Africa. It's actually an island. Is it part of the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? Correct. It is part of the southern hemisphere. You find the equator. It is below the equator, which means it's part of the southern hemisphere. Is it part of the eastern or the western hemisphere? Correct. It is part of the eastern hemisphere. All right, so you find the prime meridian. Is it on the west side or the east side? Remember, never eat soggy waffles. It is part of the western. It is not part of the west. It's part of the eastern hemisphere. Excuse me. Part of the eastern hemisphere. Last one. We're going to focus on the continent of South America. So I have it circled in green again. The continent of South America. This one is unique because if you look, find your equator. Part of South America is above the equator, and part of South America is below the equator. That means it is part of the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So northern and southern hemisphere for South America. So I have South America circled. Let's find the prime meridian, which is in blue. Is South America part of the eastern hemisphere or the western hemisphere? It is part of the western hemisphere, right? West of the prime meridian. Now, another way to find which hemisphere a city, a state, a country, a continent belongs into is find its latitude and longitude. So I have the latitude and longitude for Berlin, Germany. The coordinates is 53 degrees north, 13 degrees east. So if I want to find the hemispheres that Berlin, Germany belong to, you look at the direction of latitude and the direction of longitude. So Berlin, Germany is at 53 degrees north, which means it is part of the northern hemisphere. And since it's located in 13 degrees east longitude, it is part of the eastern hemisphere. So you know that Berlin, Germany is part of the northern half of Earth, the northern hemisphere, and the eastern half of Earth, the eastern hemisphere. I hope this quick review solidified your idea of hemispheres. Remember, they're half of Earth. There's a northern and a southern hemisphere based on the equator, and an eastern and the western hemisphere based around the prime meridian. I hope that this video helped. Always remember, today is tomorrow's history. Until next time.